Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As Chairman of the Select Committee that considered this piece of legislation, it gives me enormous pride to be speaking in the second reading debate. Sir, the Minister and the previous Labor Speaker have both alluded to the fact that we are coming up to the 5th anniversary of the Canterbury earthquakes, and really, sir, the greater tragedy than the earthquakes themselves 5 years ago would be for us as a parliament and for us as New Zealanders not to take heed of the lessons learned and not to act upon the knowledge gained as a result of those tragedies. That would be utterly remiss of us as a parliament, utterly remiss of us as a society, and utterly remiss of us as New Zealanders. So this process of getting this bill back for second reading has been an example of the Parliament of New Zealand working, I think, at its very best. The bill, as first introduced, caused a lot of angst and concern across the whole country, in fact. But we were able to, through a process of consultation, of listening, of taking advice, of working with each other, of going back to work with the Minister and his advisors, we were able to come to what I think now is a very good, satisfactory solution that will not ever guarantee that risk from future earthquakes won't occur, but much diminished risk for New Zealanders in the future will be the case as a result of this legislation passing its way through the House. Sir, our report back was a bit unique in that it had unanimous support of the committee, but we went through a process of seeking submissions early on the first iteration of the bill as it was first presented. We received 121 submissions, and then as a result of work done with the Minister and advisors and listening to the very good submissions, we significantly redrafted the bill, and we felt that it was necessary to give submitters an opportunity to come back to us again with their views on our significantly proposed changes to the legislation. And I'm pleased to report to the House, sir, that 51 of those submitters did that, and almost all of them were congratulatory of the work that had been done, because we actually had listened and taken note of their submissions. And I too want to refer to the very passionate, very compelling and committed submission from Anne Brower, who was, as other speakers have already mentioned, the sole survivor of the bus on that day. She gave remarkably confronting evidence to the committee, which made us sit up, take notice, and really get to grips with the risks that were prevalent in terms of unreinforced masonry. And I think we've got to a very good spot in terms of addressing those issues. And so the balance of public policy versus risk versus time versus cost across the country will now be spread, I think, quite evenly, quite equitably, in a way that reflects the seismic risk to the geography of the nation. And we all know that in different parts of the country there are different elements of risk. We know, for instance, that, well, I was always taught that in Auckland the great risk was of volcanic activity, and I was always taught as a kid that the great risk of earthquakes would actually be in Wellington. Well, it turns out that Christchurch, which actually wasn't mentioned when I was going to school as a risk for earthquake risk, was actually where the problem was. But we have much better information now than we had in those days, and we're able to get sensible, intelligent, scientific information about the risk to the nation. And then we overlay that, sir, with a sensible, pragmatic approach in terms of the timeframes involved. And then we spread those out, determined by the risk, by the seismic information that we have. And then we overlay that further again by acknowledging that some buildings, some public facilities, some infrastructure is more important in terms of sustaining services after an earthquake, and also in terms of the likely impacts if an earthquake was to occur, for instance, in educational facilities. And so all those layers have been, I think, very neatly and satisfactorily addressed in this redrafted bill. I too want to thank members of the committee for their work. I particularly want to thank advisors, I want to thank the Minister, and I particularly also want to acknowledge the incredible amount of work done by submitters, not once but in many cases twice, in giving of their valuable time and resource to the committee in both appearing and in preparing written material for us. As I said, sir, in my view, this was an excellent example of the Select Committee process working as it often does. For many people who watch the proceedings of this House, they often just see us barracking at each other across the chamber, and they sadly don't necessarily get to see the work that is often done in Select Committees, where good, constructive, bipartisan work is done with the intention of creating good legislation and good outcomes for the citizens of New Zealand. Sir, it's a great pleasure as the Chair of the Committee to endorse with enthusiasm the second reading of this bill, and I commend it utterly to the House.